Yes, good afternoon, students. Welcome to this presentation on environmental education EE31 for the DPP students as well as for the DJP students. Let me welcome you once again, and let me just remind you that this presentation is not an examination scope presentation. This presentation is more to guide you in terms of the module itself. Content-wise, as well as looking at a few technical aspects around assignments, as well as the examination. And then as the presentation continues, or as I go on explaining during the presentation, I will explain some of the issues to you which are very important. Now, as a start off, I want you to seriously consider the aspects which is related to your course. As you know, this course is covered basically three subjects covered into one module, which is geography, history, as well as biology. And it covers a lot of content, and it entails a lot of work. What is important when it comes to this specific module, especially when you need to do your assignments as well as your writing the exams, it is the level of questioning that you need to observe, especially in these three subject areas. It is very important that you understand what these questions require from you, especially by focusing on the key words used in the questions. For example, like describe, explain, name, list, and state. Now, it is important for you to read your questions correctly in order to answer the questions related to any assignment or any examination question. It is important whenever you do assignments or you write exam, you should actually make sure that you write clearly, and you should also consider the grammatical correctness when you write your questions or your answers. And you should please answer by focusing on what is required. And if you do not answer the questions, read the questions correctly, obviously you will not answer the questions correctly, and you will not be rewarded, which means that obviously you will lose marks. Now, some other aspects is, like I've mentioned before, is read the instructions on the questions, on the assignment questions as well as the exam questions. Always answer all the questions. If it is required of you to answer all the questions, you must do so. If you miss out on questions, obviously you will lose marks. Strictly follow numbering of questions. I've noticed, especially in assignments and in examinations, that students do not, some of you do not follow the numbering, and obviously then it makes it not easy for us as tutors to be able to follow the marking. Check allocation of marks for each question. If a question requires of you, if it's 10 marks, make sure that the answer that you provide make up for the number of marks that is allocated for each question. When you are not sure about an answer, move on to the next question. You can always go back to the unanswered question later on. Otherwise, you will waste a lot of time struggling with one question while you could have answered the next or the following question and then get back to the one that you have difficulty with. Now, looking at the aspects of the content, specifically in your module or your course. The first one is geography. The geography section covers a lot of content, and you should make sure that you study all the required sections or units of the geography section. I know that it is a lot of work, and it actually requires also a lot of attention. What is important is that you have to look at the different topics that are covered. And as you know, it covers different aspects of geomorphology, especially earthquakes and volcanoes. Now, in terms of earthquakes and volcanoes, it is important that you know what is the difference between an earthquake and a volcano. Obviously, you will have to know, or usually what we do is we would, for example, ask you to define a volcano or define an earthquake. So it's important that you know the difference between the two. Sometimes students would, instead of telling me defining an earthquake, they define a volcano. Instead of defining a volcano, they define an earthquake. So obviously it's important that you know what is the difference between these two. Another aspect is the difference between divergent boundaries and transform fault boundaries, especially, so basically you have to know the issues of the boundaries itself. And then the two different kinds. It is divergent, and the other one is the transform fault boundary. Okay. Now, yeah, that is with related to earthquake and volcanoes, as far as knowing what the two means, the difference, and the boundaries. What is also important is that when it comes to volcanoes, there are different types of volcanoes. Please remember that you also need to know what are the different types of volcanoes. So that is a few issues on the two. Now the other issue that is also important is the issue around global warming. You know that this is a very important topic these days. You have to know what it means. It's important. And you also need to know what is the effect of global warming on the, let's say, the environment. And you can also maybe look at what is the effect of global warming, say, for example, on people. So in totality, what is the impact on the environment? What is the impact on people? When you look at the environment, you can focus, for example, on the natural environment. How does it affect the natural environment, especially animals, plants, etc. So you have to know what global warming means, and then you have to know what is the effect of global warming. Sometimes you are asked to explain the impact of global warming on the environment, or in this case the natural environment, animals, people, and also on people itself. And that is global warming. And then the main factors, obviously, which affect the climate. This is covered in your guide. It explains these main factors. You should know what are the main factors that affects climate. It is main factors affecting climate. Yeah. Now, besides the issue of defining and knowing what is the difference between a volcano and an earthquake, you also know that when earthquakes and volcanoes happen, there is usually strategies that needs to be put in place so that you can manage the effects or the impacts of earthquakes and volcanoes. So what is important is that you should know what are the strategies that can be used to manage the impact of earthquakes and volcanoes. So basically what it means is that either before it happens or during the time when volcanoes or earthquake happens, there are certain things that should be put in place to manage the impact of earthquakes and volcanoes. So basically it's like strategies is what can be done to minimize the impact before it happens or manage the impact after it happens. Usually there's a lot of things that some countries would do before an earthquake takes place or a volcano erupts, and then there are some strategies or things that countries do after an earthquake or a volcano happened. So focusing on the strategies. Your guide explains these strategies quite well in terms of what can be done to make sure that the impact is minimized or managed, for that matter. It's very important. Another topic which is covered in your guide is the issue around erosion and weathering. It's important that you know the difference between the two. You need to be able to define erosion, and you also need to define the concept weathering. You need to know the difference between the two, and also the basic types of weathering. Remember, there's the definition of what weathering is, and then there's also the three basic types of weathering, and you should be able to know that as well. The difference between climate and weather, there's always a question where students will be asked, or students are always asked to explain the difference between what is weather, what is climate. So that is very important. You have to know the difference between the two. Another important another important topic is the issue around the water cycle, which is also covered in both of for DPP and DJP. I've mentioned the issues around factors which affect climate, and then the effect of climate on natural vegetation that I've also mentioned before. And those are the issues covered under the topic climate and weather. Throughout your guide and your units deal with concepts or definitions. And it's important that you know the meaning of different concepts in the guide or in your unit. Obviously, in an assignment, you are asked to do so, and sometimes when you are asked in an assignment to explain these the concepts, a lot of students just duplicate all these answers from the guide directly instead of trying to use their own words as much as possible. Obviously, if you copy directly from the guide, answers from the guide directly, you will obviously, you won't get a lot of marks for that, because it is stipulated in the assignment guide for the assignments that you should avoid excessive copying of answers from the guide. So next time when you get and prepare for an assignment, as much as possible, try to put things as you understand it, and not copy directly from the guide. A lot of marks you will be penalized for direct copying. I've mentioned to you that it's important that you understand concepts and what they mean. An example here, we have mechanical weathering, what it means. You can make a table for yourself, like the one in the example here in the presentation, where you have a list of concepts and then you write down the meaning next to each one. In terms of preparing, this is a good table for you to use as you prepare for the examination, for example. Identify those concepts. There's a glossary of concepts after each unit. And then next to each one you write the meaning, so that by the time it comes to the examination, you are well prepared in terms of, know the meaning of these concepts. For example, precipitation. What does precipitation means? Condensation and transpiration, as well as evaporation. Sometimes a student, instead of giving me the meaning of condensation, they give me the meaning. You ask them the meaning of condensation, they give you the meaning of precipitation, which is actually not correct. So that is why you need to be able to distinguish the meaning of the different concepts and make sure that it is the correct answer which you provide for the concept which is required. A few examples are weathering, compaction, volcano, earthquake, geoformology, erosion, desertification, and global warming. If I can just go back to the previous presentation. Okay, unfortunately global warming is repeated, but it is one of the important concepts. As I've explained to you in the early slide, it's important to know what the meaning of global warming is, as well as the effect of global warming. But in this case, we are talking about giving the meaning of different concepts. Now, if I may, I want to give you a few example questions, especially especially when it comes to maybe the assignments or the exam, is that you can be asked to define the following terms, like I've just explained in the previous one, where you have these tables with a meaning. You can be asked to define geoformology, erosion, compaction, weathering, climate, global warming, explain how the earth is heated. You can be asked to analyze, describe, explain. You can either be asked to analyze, you can be asked to describe or explain the stages of the hydrological or the water cycle. You know those different stages of the water cycle. You should be able to analyze, know what the different water cycles are, and then give a brief explanation of each of them, of the stages, like precipitation, condensation, transpiration, and evaporation. In some cases, you will not be asked to analyze and explain all of them, but you can be asked to maybe explain and analyze 5 or 6 of them. But in order for you will not know which 6, but in order for you to be able to answer the question, you should be able to know the different stages of the water cycle in order to answer any of the 5 or 6 that might be asked in the assignment or in the exam paper. We've briefly talked about global warming in the previous slide, but in this case, it's also important to know what is the environmental impact of volcanic eruptions or earthquakes. If I go back to the notes I wrote, I've indicated we focused on the strategies. We focused on managing impact on earthquakes and volcanoes. But this specific case, what is important in this case is also the issue around what is called the effects of volcanoes or earthquakes. On the environment, people, economy, and infrastructure. Okay, we all know that volcanoes or earthquakes can cause a lot of damage on the environment, to people, to the economy, and to infrastructure. Now, this is what we call the effects. You look at, you basically look at what damages do earthquakes and volcanoes what they cause to what I've mentioned previously. So as you can see, we're talking about damages, effects. The effects are, in most cases, the damages which is caused by earthquakes and volcanoes to the environment, people, economy, and the infrastructure. It's important that you know. So a question can be phrased where you have to explain the effects, describe or explain the effects, or it can ask, explain or describe the impact. So there's basically 2 ways of how this can be done. And it's important you have to know not only about what the volcano and the earthquake is and the strategies to manage the impact of volcanoes and earthquakes, but also what are the impact or the effects that these 2 have on people, environment, economy, and the infrastructure. Okay. We've mentioned the difference between the volcano and an earthquake in the previous slide. Important that you know that. And we also said look at the strategies. In this case, you can be asked to describe the strategies that can be used to manage the effect of an earthquake or volcanoes. Some other sample questions may include mention the main factors which affect climate, mention the factors of soil formation, explain the 3 basic types of weathering, identify the weather instruments used, for example, for measuring air and sea surface temperature, measuring atmospheric pressure, measuring humidity, measuring wind speed, and measuring liquid precipitation over a set period of time. What the last question is basically asking you is the fact that you should know the different weathering instruments. We use instruments, we call them weather instruments, and these instruments are used to measure different aspects of weather. So you have to know what is the instrument that we use for measuring air and sea surface temperature. You have to know the instrument for measuring atmospheric pressure, measuring humidity, measuring wind speed, measuring liquid precipitation over a set period of time. So these are all related to weather. Remember, I've mentioned the difference between weather and climate, but part of weather and climate also is that we use certain instruments for measuring certain weather aspects or issues related to weather, whether it is wind speed, humidity, or precipitation. You have to know those instruments. Now, in geography, in the geography section, usually we can use diagrams to test your understanding of information as well as your knowledge. So these diagrams are not there to trick you, but the diagrams are put in so that you to know that if you are able to identify, for example, a specific diagram and what the diagram means. For example, we have two diagrams in this specific example. This one specifically, the one on the on my left is the one on precipitation, and the other one, for example, is the Stevenson screen. These are two diagrams which can be used in it can be used in an assignment question or an exam question. But the purpose is to give you the diagram so that to test if you know, identify the diagram, and so that you can explain issues around the diagram or the specific diagram. If we go back to this one on the right, which is the Stevenson screen, as you know, or as you have, when you went through your unit, you came across the Stevenson screen, which is a weather station. And in this specific weather station, there are certain instruments in this weather station, and you should also know what these instruments are that are being kept in this specific in this weather box, if I can call it that. There was an example question where it was asked for students to identify the instruments that are kept in this box, and a lot of students, most of the students were able to answer the question. Some students were not. They could, for example, only identify the diagram or the illustration, but they could not answer the questions related to the specific diagram. So make sure that you not only know that this is a Stevenson screen, but you should know what are the instruments that are kept inside this specific weather station. The way that questions are being asked can also be different. You can be given columns, for example, where you have column A, column B. I can see column A is the statement, and then column B is actually the corresponding answer. If you look at the one in column A, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 statements, and on the left-hand side there are seven answers. So you should be able, in order for you to answer the question correctly, to identify the correct answer in column B, you should read the first the statement in column A correctly, so that you link the answer from B to the statement in A. And there are a few examples. So firstly, we can use diagrams in an assignment or examination. We can use answers where you have to answer the question, choose a term from column B that match with the description in column A. Or we can use maps, and we can use illustrations. And then you should be able to know exactly what the answer is, especially if you are asked to identify the weather instruments also in the diagram that is illustrated here. So that is the the geography section. The next section of your guide is the history section. And let me, by starting off by saying that most students, they lose a lot of marks when it comes to the history section. I don't know if they just decide to focus on geography and biology and then think that if they do good in the two, they will pass the exam or pass the assignment. It is important that you give equal weight to all three of these sections: geography, history, and biology. The history section, based on what is covered in DPP and DJP, in most cases the content is the same. It's just here and there where they slightly differ. The units that is covered in your guide focus on the South African occupation of Namibia in 1915. Obviously, you have to know the reasons why South Africa occupied Namibia in 1915. And then South African colonial administration from 1945 to 1979. And then the development of Namibian nationalism, the system of apartheid, what apartheid means, you must give the meaning, the different apartheid laws, the role of the church on the road to independence, and importantly, the various political parties established to resist apartheid in Namibia. Well, I know it sounds a mouthful, but it is important that when you go through your units, you make sure that you read with understanding. If you start with the South African occupation of 1915, obviously what is important is for you to know why. Why was Namibia occupied in 1915? What are the reasons for that? And then South African colonial administration, 1945 to 1979. You must remember there are periods, time periods which is covered here. 1945, 1979. And what is the meaning of Namibian nationalism? Why was it called Namibian nationalism? And then the system of apartheid. What is the meaning of the word or the concept apartheid? This question was asked so many times, so that you get to understand, so that students can, get the understanding of what they understand by the term apartheid. And then the different apartheid laws, the laws that were passed, apartheid laws that were passed during the time. The African struggle for independence and economic development, especially the DJP students, the OAU for the DJP students. World history in the 20th century, that is for both the DJP and DPP students. Peace treaties after World War I, especially the Treaty of Versailles, 1919. The Cold War in Europe, the founding of NATO, the founding of the Warsaw Pact, the League of Nations, as well as the United Nations. If we can stand still here for a while, I just want to focus on a few issues. Now, when you look at the peace treaties, if you are anything around the peace treaties, especially say there were different peace treaties. Now, especially the Treaty of Versailles. (1919). Sometimes you will be asked, or sometimes you can be asked in terms of how effective was the treaties. Then you have to give give your opinion. When you are asked to give your opinion, it's like a statement. It's like you agree or you disagree. If you say, for example, that the peace treaties was effective, you must say why you say so. If you say it was not effective, you must state why. If you decide that you want to say it was both effective and not effective, then you must state, give your reasons. You must give your reasons. If you disagree, give your reasons. If you agree, then you must also give your, if you agree, give your reasons. If you disagree, then give your reasons. Sometimes students just say yes, and sometimes no, without giving their opinions or why they say yes or no. If you tell me yes, obviously I cannot give you a mark for yes, because you have to now give me, if you say yes, then you must give me reasons why you say yes. If you say no, you must give reasons why you say no. And the Treaty of Versailles, as you know, that the Treaty of Versailles, especially the punishment to Germany. How did the treaty punish Germany? Or what punishment did the Treaty of Versailles hand out to Germany? This is actually a question which have been asked in some exams, and the students were not able to really tell me what punishment was handed out to Germany. It means that you have to explain how was Germany punished by the Treaty of Versailles. As you know, that Germany was punished in a number of ways. So you have to explain the ways in which Germany was punished. Especially with regard around, Germany was responsible for the First World War. Obviously, Germany had to pay. So Germany had to pay reparations. Paying reparations and being responsible for the war is an example of a punishment. The fact that the army was reduced in numbers and some of the overseas colonies were taken away is an example of punishment, how Germany was punished by the Treaty of Versailles. So it is important that you know what did the Treaty of Versailles, the Treaty of Versailles do, or the outcome of the treaty in terms of punishing Germany for causing, for example, the First World War. That is very important. Another very important issue is the formation of NATO and Warsaw Pact. The formation. A very important question is why? Why were they formed? you have to know and give reasons why these two were formed. Remember, these two is an outflow, let's call it outflow of the Cold War. Another important concept is Cold War, meaning. What is the meaning of this specific term? And as the outflow, NATO was formed and the Warsaw Pact. It's important that you provide an explanation of why these two were formed. I've asked this question previously, and then some students provided an answer saying that these two were formed so that other countries can keep out. I mean, that's not the reason for the formation of the two. You have to explain why NATO was formed and why the Warsaw Pact was formed. Remember, these are two different organizations, two opposite organizations. Remember, NATO was formed. The reason for NATO being formed is to, it's a defense. It was like a defense organization against communism. So they wanted to make sure that communism does not spread in Europe. And then you have to provide the reason why you think Warsaw Pact was formed. If NATO was formed as a defense against communism, obviously the Warsaw Pact was formed against something else. Okay, so there are also a few other units that you need to go through. The same as with geography, there is also some concepts that is covered in your history unit, as well as you have to know the meanings. The same goes with where you are asked to choose a term and match them with a description in column A. By now you should be familiar with all these concepts in column B, like totalitarianism, apartheid, socialism, fascism, and Cold War. There are a few example questions of, especially the history section, as I've just explained. For example, question B. What is also important is question A. You have to cover the United Nations as well as the League of Nations and the AOU or the AU, and then you have to know what were the roles and the aims of these organizations, and also what were the successes and failures of these different organizations. There are a few sample questions, especially when it comes to the history section. You can also be asked questions that are based on cartoons, these funny pictures. But these funny pictures they are used for you to test your understanding, even if it is in a very funny way. But most cases, the pictures is based on a certain event that took place in history. There's another example. And then the biology section. A lot of students do quite good in the biology section, but like I've said, you need to make sure that you give equal attention to geography, history, and biology when it comes to preparation. I've mentioned global warming before, and in the geography section, it is also covered in the biology section. There's a lot of concepts to be covered as well. There's the issue around DNA and the function of DNA. So basically, it is the structure of DNA as well as the function of DNA that is important. The issues around seed disposal, global warming, conservation, the definition, of concepts in biology. There's a few examples. And then the same is the choosing terms in column B with the description in column A. Sometimes if it's not asked this way, you can be asked to define the concept haploid, omnivore, carnivore, or mitosis. Like in geography and history, you can also be asked to answer questions based on diagrams. These are visual aspects, for example, of a fetus or the female or the male reproductive system. And there we have a few examples of diagrams that can be used in an assignment or an exam, and then testing your understanding of the information related to these diagrams and your knowledge as well. Some other diagrams or pictures that can also be used as illustrated here. And then it is important to know the function of the different female and male reproductive systems. So obviously you will have to know who's responsible for the release of an egg, fertilization, the baby passing through here during birth. So that is the function, and the description should be provided. We have, for example, the male reproductive system, where you have to indicate. It means that you have to know which system is responsible for which function. As in the female reproductive system, you have to know which reproductive system is what is the function of that reproductive system. Okay, some sample questions is highlighted for you here. It is important that you use these questions in order for you to prepare yourself for any assignment or exam, and also make use of previous exam question papers, assignment questions, so that you can get an idea of what you might or can expect when it comes to assessing the unit or the module. So okay. The contact details are there. If you need any information, you can contact me, and then I will be able to see how I can assist you in any of the issues that you might have problems with. I thank you.